Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening to you all. It is with great pleasure that I am able to say a few words about our special guest, Dr. M. Masrur Reaz. Dr. Reaz completed his doctorate from the University of Manchester in UK in Development Economics and MBA from the University of New Orleans, USA. During the beginning of his career, he worked in the academia as an assistant professor of economics and finance, and in the private sector as well. He also served as an advisor in the economic growth team of UK's Department for International Development prior to joining the World Bank Group. During his tenure with the World Bank Group, Dr. Reaz, since 2012, heads the World Bank Group's Investment Climate Reform Program in Bangladesh and leads the World Bank Group's support to Government of India on reform efforts related to ease of doing business. Well, he also headed World Bank Group's Investment Climate Reform Program in Nepal from year 2013 to 2014 and led a strategy team in 2013 to develop trade and competitiveness program in Sri Lanka. Well, presently, Dr. Reaz serves as a senior economist and program manager in the trade and competitiveness global practice of the World Bank Group. Well, some of his work in Bangladesh includes the electronic tax registration at the NBR, National Board of Revenue, the automation of company registration, the autonomy of several investor services at the Board of Investment, legal institution framework for economic zones, reforms in the VAT and custom legislations. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hand together for Dr. M. Masrur Reaz.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Barrister Rahman, Head of Chambers, our guest of honor today, Mr. Saiful Islam, my dear Saiful Bhai, practitioners and staff at the Rahman Chambers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good evening. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to be able to join you all to celebrate the 11th anniversary of Rahman Chambers at this annual dinner program. I consider this as a great privilege. I'm also thankful to Barrister Rahman for inviting me to speak on Companies Act, particularly from the perspective of Bangladesh's economy, the competitiveness issues, and how Companies Act, the modernization of Companies Act or lack of it actually has an impact or impacting Bangladesh in its overall business environment. I thought this is very timely given the economic evolution that Bangladesh has progressed through over the past few decades and what Bangladesh aspires to do by 2021 and 2041, and I'll come to those aspirations in a few seconds. So, Companies Act, it is probably the most overarching legislative instrument affecting private sector in any country. Absolutely in Bangladesh, but it's called Companies Act, it's called Corporate Act, it has different names, but the spirit of this particular law is really the fundamental platform for private sector to operate, and then you add sectoral regulatory framework to that, which forms the overall business environment. Now, aspirations that I just mentioned about Bangladesh. Bangladesh has made an impressive economic journey and social journey over the past at least 2 decades, but at least, or actually over 4 decades. The economy has tripled. Poverty has gone down significantly from close to more than 40% around 2000 to less than 24% this year. And extreme poverty is down to 12%. Export growth has been double-digit for many years until last year. Employment creation in terms of formal and higher wage employment, Bangladesh has done a fantastic job over the last 2 decades. And as we all know, this is one of the few countries which have maintained a more than 6% economic growth rate for almost about 10 years now. So this is a fantastic achievement, and based on these achievements, what Bangladesh aspires to do is to become a full middle income country by 2021. It is already a lower middle income country. It aspires to become full middle income by 2021, and as the Prime Minister has set out, the country also aspires to become a high income or developed country by 2041, which will require Bangladesh to treble its current GDP at a minimum. Bangladesh needs to scale up in a number of areas if it is to attain that middle income and developed country status over the target period. The Bangladesh at a minimum needs to create about 2 million jobs every year. About 2.2 million people come to job market every year in Bangladesh. This taking advantage of the demographic dividend that Bangladesh has. Bangladesh has a target to take investment to the rate of 34% of GDP by 2021, this current 5-year plan. $9.5 billion of FDI a year, $54 billion of export, 50% of trade GDP ratio, currently it's 43%, up from 18% which was in 1994. Massive improvement, but the improvement need going forward is also very big. A large part of these is going to be the poverty reduction as well as, I missed one other point, this 6.5% growth rate, which has been very impressive, it is not going to be enough for Bangladesh to make it a full middle income country by even 2025. Bangladesh needs to grow at a minimum 7.5 to 8%. And it's possible based on the foundations that Bangladesh laid. It's very much possible. The biggest driver there is going to be the private sector or the investment, private investment. It will have to be a private investment, private sector-led growth fueled by export or global value chain participation. Now, that's where legislation or a policy framework such as Companies Act is going to be extremely instrumental. It is going to be instrumental because Companies Act is directly linked to the formalization of businesses. Bangladesh has seen massive growth of private sector over the last few decades. However, the large part of the economy is still informal. 88% of employment are also in informal sector. The sooner or faster Bangladesh can drive these informal enterprises and informal jobs to formal sector, the quicker it will be for Bangladesh to become a middle income country or a higher income country. Ease of doing business. The kind introducer just mentioned about some of my work. You know about the global doing business ranking, which is probably the most popular and most widely accepted benchmark around the world to gauge a country's business environment. It has 10 indicators. At least 4 of them heavily depend on the quality of the Companies Act. And Bangladesh is not doing well there. It's 177 out of 190 countries. Arab Republic of Syria is above Bangladesh, and we all know what has been going on in Syria for the last 5 years. Yet they're above Bangladesh. Only Afghanistan in South Asia is below Bangladesh. So if Bangladesh needs to improve or will have to improve this, if Bangladesh wants, by the way, the Prime Minister has given a vision on this as well, a double-digit rank by 2021. So Bangladesh will need at least a 77 position improvement by next 4 to 5 years. And if Bangladesh wants to do it, improving and modernizing the Companies Act is going to be absolutely critical for Bangladesh to do that. Now, why are we talking about improvements in Companies Act? There are several reasons. I mean, I've just mentioned a few. Formalization. Now, if we look at the current Companies Act, which is 1994, I think most of us would agree when we go through the Act, large part of the provisions and the principles are still from 1930, when the private sector almost did not exist in Bangladesh, other than shops and maybe few manufacturing plants in very primitive stage. So these provisions are not still very favorable in terms of companies entering or entrepreneurs entering businesses. Companies Act has an impact at an entry level, at an operations level, at an exit level as well. It is overarching its impact. So the clarities, the automation we know we are in digital Bangladesh, we are in the age of technology, but the Companies Act does very little to support adoption of technology either by the regulator or by companies in its current form. So there needs to be an improvement in terms of the clarity for formalization, as well as things such as adoption of technology by both government regulators as well as private sector. Lengthy court approval processes for many things. For example, you mentioned about winding up, and we all know winding up, how complicated that process is. You not only have to go to court, you need a lengthy, about 8 to 9 months, I guess, on an average is required. There is regulatory incompatibility with other legislative pieces. So if you go and look at the city corporation laws and regulations, some of which dominate trade licensing and other relevant provisions, if you look at some of the Board of Investment related provisions, if you look at the TIN, particularly the electronic TIN and the VAT, a lot of the provision in the Companies Act, while they don't stop you, they're not entirely compatible with many other laws. So there is a need to upgrade and harmonize these with the other legislative and regulatory framework. SMEs, we know how important they are. And where do you get now? M's can be very big, but S's are usually not very big. And S's, the smalls, they come from micro enterprises. In Thailand, which is a country of much progress and prosperity, 99% of the farms are categorized as SMEs. In countries like UK, New Zealand, and many other countries, to encourage formalization of enterprises as well as growth of small companies, single membership companies are allowed. As far as I know, it has been brought in India as well, but as we all know, Bangladesh Companies Act does not allow that. And then, of course, lack of clarity regarding listed companies versus non-listed companies and ad hoc measures, which lead to ad hoc measures, is not good for corporate governance of the country. And finally, the exit options. As I say, Companies Act is expected to facilitate not only entry, but also operations as well as exit. And exit is a right of businesses. Legal, lawful exit is a right of businesses everywhere. But in case of Bangladesh, this is theoretically open. However, we all know in practice how difficult this is going to be. So there is an initiative going on for last, well, unfortunately it's been about 5 years now, but I mean, this is to reform and modernize the Companies Act. The World Bank Group, particularly my unit, Trade and Competitiveness, we are associated with this through our support to the Ministry of Commerce. Some provisions have been identified. I mean, there are many provisions. Companies Act are usually one of the largest laws. In UK, when we talk to the UK's ministry, we oversee their Companies Act, we came to know this is the largest piece of legislation in UK, the Companies Act. So there are many changes which are being sought, but I'll just cite a few. I'll just highlight a few. For example, share buyback and treasury shares. At the moment, it's difficult or perhaps restricted for many companies to buy back their shares. That creates a problem in terms of governance in capital market, and it also limits the freedom and the flexibility of companies who opt to become public, and the proposition in terms of modernization would, if implemented, would allow these buybacks. Employee stock scheme or sweat equity is the age of intellectual property, right? It's the age of knowledge or knowledge-driven economy. So companies, if you look at Silicon Valley, they thrive on, even Bangalore, don't have to go so far, even Bangalore, they thrive on the intellectual inputs of the employees. Salary is not even always enough to actually retain such competent, intellectually driven staff in companies. So what Bangladesh does not, the current Companies Act does not provide for, is the provisions for private equity, mezzanine financing, or sweat equity for employees, so employee stock schemes and things like that. Reducing provision of object loss. Everybody can change object loss. Nothing stops them eventually. So why is the process so complicated? Constraining flexibility and decision-making process of the private companies. few more. Single member company I just mentioned. Mandatory requirement of appointing secretary by public listed companies. This has huge implication on corporatization of the business environment or the public-private sector in Bangladesh, as well as strengthening the corporate governance. Abolition of requirement of taking approval for holding AGM, just to make it fast, quick and simple. Restriction on declaration of dividend without first adjusting cumulative losses. Specific provisions on the adoption on company's name. And finally, simplifying winding up. I mean, nobody would call for totally going for a scot-free environment where anybody can wind up anytime without following any rules or guidelines. All that is being solicited for is simplify the process and perhaps make it easier, particularly for small and medium companies. Now, one other aspect which is very important and gets quite a lot of impact from a country's Companies Act, and something Farooq also alluded to, is the whole issue of merger and acquisition. Now, in Bangladesh, I think as I have mentioned, as we all know, the country has progressed tremendously over the last few decades. The private sector has grown tremendously. It's a private sector-led economy. And we have now come to a level where we are also ready to even invest cross-border. Of course, that has to be through proper guidelines, monitoring, and through some systematic measures. But we now have sophisticated entrepreneurs, sophisticated firms such as Western Marine Shipyard, exporting ships to countries like Germany and Denmark. It's about time when a lot of companies around the world, particularly in Asia, they're eyeing on Bangladesh. I know for sure from our interaction with governments in Singapore and Japan, they are seriously interested about investment, their companies investing in Bangladesh. Now, when they make the first move, one of their preferred option is not the only option, but one of their preferred option is not to go into greenfield, because this is new market for them. They want to, come in, test the pulse, test the waters, understand the territory, and then sort of put their own, greenfield investment. One of the common technique or mechanism around the world is to actually acquire companies. Acquisition, the amalgamation we just mentioned. I was talking to one of the top 5 consulting companies, the big 5, like Ernst & Young, McKinsey, PwC. So I was talking to one of them recently, and they say their business or their unit that deals with merger and acquisition in Bangladesh has become really busy these days because they're getting so much of queries and active requests from companies, particularly from East Asia. And majority of them do not want to set up a greenfield factory in Bangladesh because all of them, and this is perfectly normal, and it's not unique to Bangladesh, it happens everywhere. They want to acquire a company in Bangladesh and gradually expand their capacity, and then at the right time they want to also set up greenfield factories. And the current provisions in the Companies Act are not very favorable for that. It's, again, as Farooq said, you can do it, but the cost, the time, the process, the complications are not very encouraging for those foreign investors trying to come to Bangladesh. There are foreign financiers. We all know about the Bangladesh's financial sector. It has a lot of great strength, but it has some limitation. And I think Saiful Bhai will agree with me, Bangladeshi entrepreneurs have always said the cost of fund is very high here. So Bangladesh, based on its progress, has now also attracted the attention of quality international lenders and financiers. They want to lend in Bangladesh. And this finance are very high quality, means longer term, comes with a lot of additional benefits such as market access, and also much lower in terms of cost compared to Bangladesh's domestic borrowing or financing. Now, they don't necessarily look for merger or acquisition, but what they look for is strength of the company. Now, when, for example, DEG is a German government-backed international financing institution, many of you know. They are very keen on intensifying, stepping up their overall investment in Bangladesh. IFC, International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, provides equity and loan financing to Bangladesh, to private sector companies. They want to step up from current $700 million a year to $1.5 billion a year. But what they're looking for are strong companies, right? Now, when they look for, there are many strong companies, but when you put them through the international benchmark or the lens, some companies go through, but many companies don't. However, there is a concept called group of companies. When you combine 3, 4, 5, or even 2 firms under a group of company, or 2 firms in the same sector, their consolidated accounts qualify. However, the mergers are not happening, or group of company, which is not a, I understand, not a legal concept, and a holding company, people are not incentivized because of double taxation issue, and the Companies Act does not provide for that sort of consolidation of account within same group. And it, sorry, somebody is telling me I'm way over time, so I'll do it in wrap it up in 2 minutes. So the Companies Act does not provide for favorable provision either to consolidate company accounts, group accounts, which can be then accepted by the international financier. Neither does it provide enough favorable provision for 2 or 3 firms in a sector to come together and form a stronger entity which can qualify for this quality international financing. And then of course we all know also about the banking sector. There is very credible questions in this country about, given the size of the economy which is growing, whether there is a need for 50+ private banks or not. I think some of the recent banking problems are really a manifestation about the problem that these questions really try to highlight. It's not only about time now, it's been high time for many years when some banking companies needed to merge and consolidate their financial strength as well as address their problems. This probably would require a political decision, given these are banks and how influenced the banks are in many countries politically. But merger and acquisition probably is the way forward to address many of the problems that the current Bangladeshi banking sector is going through. And then finally, the startup movement or the ICT sector. You know, again, I say this is the time of technology. We are in digital Bangladesh. It is only a matter of time when we see the ICT sector, ICT companies would be growing in numbers and sizes. And we will also see startup movement to take a very strong footing together with that. And when you have startup movement, when you want to encourage startup movement and bring them into fruition, into mainstream corporate activities, the merger and acquisition activities are going to be extremely important. I mean, if you look at Silicon Valleys, many ideas come from individual researchers or small entrepreneurs or small technology entrepreneurs. And at a certain time, big companies come in, they do amalgamation, they do acquire partial or entire company, and then they take it to a sort of national or global level. So if we are to keep our speed aligned to the movement of the ICT sector, the technology space, as well as the startup movement, I think bringing in favorable merger and acquisition provisions in our Companies Act is going to be extremely critical. So with that, let me stop here. We would all like to hear from Saiful Bhai, who sort of brings the direct private sector experience here. And at the end, I would like to wish Rahman Chambers the very best for the coming years. And once again, congratulations on completing 11 years. Thank you so much.